Okay, so civil liberties. The main thing I want to talk about here actually is the Incorporation Doctrine. Most of the other details, most of the details of the different amendments and how they've been interpreted and what they mean, just what the text is and so on. A lot of what is in the PowerPoints, you can get that from the textbook. It's pretty clear. The sort of big idea here that we want to focus on and make sure is clear is the Incorporation Doctrine. Okay. And this basically revolves around the question, does the Bill of Rights apply to the states? Okay, and this is in the very first few slides, the Bill of Rights in the states. There's the definition of the civil liberties in the second slide. And the third slide, does the Bill of Rights apply to the state governments, or does it limit the state governments? So the Bill of Rights obviously limits what the federal government can do. The First Amendment, for instance, Congress can pass no law establishing a state religion. That limits what the federal government can do. Does the Bill of Rights also apply to or limit what the state governments can do? And the first Supreme Court decision to deal with this was Barron v. Baltimore in 1833, and that said no. That said, actually, the Bill of Rights applies only to the national government, not to the state governments, okay? A guy named Barron owned a wharf. The city of Baltimore built a road. A lot of the runoff from the road went down and fell into the water where this guy's wharf was, and now the water was too shallow for boats to go in. And so basically what happened there was he didn't have it was no longer profitable. So he said, the city of Baltimore has damaged my property. It owes me compensation because the Fifth Amendment says you can't take property away from someone without just compensation. The Supreme Court said that's true. The Fifth Amendment says that, but the Fifth Amendment is in the national Constitution. So therefore it doesn't apply to states or cities. Okay, the state of Maryland, the city of Baltimore can do whatever it wants. It's only limited by its own state constitution. And if there's no provision in the Maryland state constitution for this situation, then sorry, Mr. Barron, you have no recourse here. Okay. About 100 years later, in a Supreme Court decision, Gitlow v. New York in 1925, the Supreme Court said yes, and it articulated the Incorporation Doctrine. It says that the 14th Amendment incorporates the National Bill of Rights into every state constitution. Okay, so this is the Incorporation Doctrine. The idea is you have a National Bill of Rights and it's been incorporated into each individual state constitution. So now, as of 1925, each individual state is bound, limited. It must comply with, it must honor the Bill of Rights, the rights that are laid out for citizens in the National Bill of Rights, as well as the individual state constitutions. So it's somewhat ironic because, of course, initially everybody thought, well, the states will protect people's rights better than the national government. This was a big concern of the Anti-Federalists. As it turns out, in many cases, the state bills of rights were less extensive than the National Bill of Rights. And, of course, that was largely because of the efforts of the Anti-Federalists. But for instance, in many states, I mean, it's in the National Bill of Rights. You have to have an attorney present if you're being prosecuted. For many years, this was not in there. Many states did not have this in their state constitution. So you could be tried for a capital offense in many states, and people were, So in other words, they were facing the death penalty, and if they were too poor to afford a lawyer for themselves, the state would not provide them one. It wasn't until the 1960s that this was actually incorporated. Okay, so in many ways, the National Bill of Rights is more expansive and gives people more protections than state bills of rights. Now, with the Incorporation Doctrine, as of 1925, the National Bill of Rights applies to the states. However, the Supreme Court can't just say, and now all of the individual rights in the National Bill of Rights are applied to the states. They had to be incorporated one at a time by individual Supreme Court decisions because the Supreme Court cannot just issue broad proclamations like that. Okay, so each individual right has to be incorporated by a specific Supreme Court decision. That's why some rights were incorporated in the 1920s or 30s, rights involving freedom of speech, for instance. Others, it wasn't until decades later. So, for instance, the right to counsel, that was not incorporated until looking for it in the slides here, but that was not incorporated until the early 1960s by a Supreme Court decision then, because basically, again, these have to be incorporated one at a time. The Supreme Court has to make specific incorporations. So the right to counsel was not incorporated until 1963 in a Supreme Court case called Gideon v. Wainwright. Okay, so you were always guaranteed counsel in federal courts by the Sixth Amendment, but not always in state courts. Okay, so the Federal Bill of Rights applies to the states. That's what the Incorporation Doctrine is about. But again, each individual right has to be incorporated individually. So what changed? What changed between 1833 and 1925? The change was the 14th Amendment. When Barron sued the city of Baltimore, he said the Fifth Amendment says you cannot take away people's property without compensating them, and you cannot deny people due process of the law. And again, the Supreme Court said that's true when you're talking about the national government, but not necessarily when you're talking about the state governments. The 14th Amendment, and we'll see this is very important for civil liberties as well as civil rights. The 14th Amendment basically gives people rights as citizens of the United States, okay? So the 14th Amendment, Section 1 reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So in other words, they are citizens of the national government as well as citizens of the state where they reside. No state, so no individual state, shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So again, focusing here on the fact that they are citizens of the national government. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So here, the 14th Amendment, very clear, black and white in the Constitution, you have certain rights, certain fundamental personal liberties, certain fundamental personal rights and liberties, as the Supreme Court said in Gitlow, as a citizen of the United States, as a citizen of the national government. So again, as a citizen of the United States, you have certain fundamental personal rights and liberties that are guaranteed by the Constitution. No individual state can take those rights away. So again, here we have the change we talked about with federalism. How did you move from a situation where the 10th Amendment says all rights not given to the federal government or denied to the states are reserved for the states? Well, right here, the 14th Amendment puts a much greater restriction on the states and what they can do. It denies them a lot more powers. Okay, so the powers were formerly reserved for the states. Well, now certain powers are no longer reserved for them. They no longer clearly do not have the power or the right to deny people the rights that they're given by the national Constitution. And again, this was done by the 14th Amendment. So this was the basis of the Incorporation Doctrine. Okay, the other major point here is the distinction between the two types of due process. Again, the 14th Amendment brings this in. There's procedural due process. That basically is the set of procedures that you have to follow for an arrest or something like that to be legal. So when people are not Mirandized, and again, the book discusses what that means, then their conviction can be thrown out. That's procedural due process, but there's also the idea of substantive due process, which basically means that there's something wrong with the substance of the law, for instance, segregation, for instance. Okay? So that distinction is very important. But again, the key here, Incorporation Doctrine applies the National Bill of Rights to the states or incorporates the National Bill of Rights into the Constitution of each individual state. The basis for this is the 14th Amendment, which again changed the Constitution. So what the Constitution actually said changed dramatically. It took a long time to actually interpret it clearly and enforce it correctly, but clearly what it said is, again, you have certain rights as a citizen of the United States, certain fundamental personal rights and liberties, which no individual state can take away. And again, this changes the entire relationship between the national and state governments, and again, changes the situation regarding civil liberties. Which civil liberties do you have as a citizen? In any state, you have all of the rights that are given to you by the national Constitution.